Hi, this is Mark from rivertables.es. Today I'm going to be making a coffee table out of this olive wood which we've recently just taken out of the kiln. For those of you who have worked with olive wood before, you'll know it takes an inordinate amount of time to dry naturally. So we've built ourselves a kiln and this olive wood is now showing about 7%. I'll also be demonstrating how we can fill the holes which appear during the completion process of resin tables, which at the best of times can be quite challenging. So we'll go over a couple of tricks and tips about how best to approach these. In addition, I'd like to demonstrate just the benefits of using HDPE molds. Since we've started using HDPE molds, it really has been a game changer, particularly when you have large holes on the underside of the table which need to be filled. So you can take the project out of the HDPE mold, turn it over, you haven't destroyed the mold, and then you can go again. HDPE molds are completely reusable, so there's no limit to the number of times that you can use them. So I start off the process by flattening the wood. I want to end up with a table around 40 or 42 millimeters in thickness, so I'm going to reduce this wood down to about 55, with an estimation being that I'll probably lose another 5 millimeters either side in the finishing process. For those of you that are interested in this router sled, I'll put a link below. I've done a separate video explaining the pros and cons of this router sled and the tricks and the mistakes that I made when I built this sled. But having been using it for the past year or so, it's not quite as good as a white belt sander, but it certainly does the job, and it's pretty efficient. There's quite a variation in the thickness of these three pieces, so just starting with the thickest one first, just taking off 1.5 or 2 millimeters at a time. Not too much. They're not clamped down in any specific way. It just held in place by a couple of blocks, and just taken off a small amount at a time. It just reduces the finishing requirements from the sanding because it leaves less marks on the wood itself. So just doing a quick double check for the thickness of the wood. It's coming out at 57 millimeters, which is perfect. And as you can see here, the natural cracks that appear in the wood, which should look great when they're filled with resin. They appear on the top side and the underside, but they don't go all the way through. So consequently, what we'll need to do is once the first pour is set, we can take it out of the HDPE mold, flip it over, and then just fill those smaller cracks with the quick 24-hour epoxy, and then we'll have the holes filled on both sides. You'll see when we come on to the pouring phase of the video that I don't seal the wood either on the sides or on the top. I give it a full flood coat and let it seep into all the holes. I mean, there's two trains of thought with regards to sealing wood. Some people are in favour, some people not. I generally find with a softer wood, anything from a walnut down, then it's probably a good idea to seal the wood because the resin can stain. But certainly on this harder wood, it's very difficult for the colouring to get into or penetrate into the wood. And even if it does on the surface, if you're taking off between 3 and 4 mil on the finishing process, then any penetration certainly won't go that deep. Olive wood for me is certainly one of the most beautiful woods. The finishing is absolutely exquisite. It does, however, have its fair share of dead wood. The natural life of the olive tree is about 100 years or so, during which time it is continually pruned to keep it as low as possible, and then flower as much as possible, thereby producing the most fruit. But in doing so, what they do is open up the top of the trunk to the elements, and you get a lot of water penetration. Consequently, you have a lot of wood that needs to be removed, a lot of dead wood that needs to be taken out if you're going to do one of these projects. So I've probably spent a good part of 4 or 5 hours on these three pieces, just getting away all the dead wood, and then just sanding the sides to make a nice finish. The customer for this table wanted a finished product of around 80 centimeters by 50 centimeters. The only other criteria that she stipulated was that she wanted the majority of the table to be covered by wood, which for me is great because whenever I make one of these tables, I make a table from wood which is complemented by the resin as opposed to vice versa. So looking for a finished product of 80 by 50 roughly, I'll mark out 85 by 55 and then can trim the edges on the table saw. So here we have the finished layout of how the table will be. We've got a little bit of wood left over, so I'm going to make her a small serving tray. We don't need to make a separate mould, we can use the existing HDPE mould, just put a couple of inserts in there and then we can pour at the same time. This HDPE mould I've probably used more than a dozen times and it still looks brand new. There's no duct tape or release spray that's required. We sell a lot of these moulds at rivertables.es. I'll put a link to our website below, and at the end of the video I'll put a discount code which can be applied to any moulds that you want to buy. So before we silicone the sides of the moulds, just make sure everything fits. We've got the inserts in there as well, as you can see, for the small serving tray. Take a quick photo, because of the number of times I've taken the wood out to silicone the edges and put it back in correctly. Only 3 pieces, still get confused, and then we're good to silicone the sides. You don't need to win any awards with the siliconing. There's probably 3 or 4 mil around the outside of the wood anyway, to allow for the silicone to run between the mould sides and the wood itself. The inserts, I'm just going to silicone them in place. Once the silicone's set, then the inserts will be pretty sturdy. So after letting the silicone set for 24 hours or overnight at least, we're ready to start pouring the resin. The company I'm using here is Epoxy. It's a German company. I'm not affiliated anyway. It's a 700 Pro deep pour resin. A little bit of a strange ratio. It's a 100 to 32. So when you are mixing this, just take your total volume, divide it by 132, then times 100 will give you your part A, times by 32 will give you your part B. With regards to calculating the resin for this particular project, it's a little bit of a thumb suck because of the shape of the wood. So what I did was take the total volume of the mould itself, if you call it 85 by 55 by 6, comes out to about 28,000 cubic centimetres. Which converts into 28 litres, and I figured the wood probably took between 60 and 70% of that in volume, so I calculated 40% of 28 litres, which came out at 11 litres, so I worked on that basis. So mixing outside, always a good tip, saves any damage to the floor, and I always change buckets, always just transfer it into a smaller bucket before I pour. Just gives you more accuracy, and it also stops any of the residue which is potentially unmixed from getting into the mould. Had to be a little bit creative with clamping the wood down because there are so many different pieces, particularly on the serving tray. But as you can see, I'm pouring over the entirety of the wood. I'm going to flood the whole thing. I want the resin to get into all the nooks and crannies and fill all those holes. Hopefully it will be sufficient. Let's see. So go over the resin with a heat gun, just getting rid of any bubbles that have risen to the surface. On something like this, it's not as important as the wood is completely submerged in the resin. But what is important is to go over with a brush, just to get rid of any micro bubbles that become attached to the side of the wood. So I left it for about 4 days before I came back. The resin is nice and hard, and now you can really see the benefit of the HDPE mould. The sides just pop off, and only a small amount of encouragement is needed to release the table and the serving tray from the base of the mould. The black marks you can see on the sides of the HDPE moulds is in fact from the silicone, not from the resin. It just shows the benefits of this non-adhesive properties that this HDPE has. So because we have the natural cracks on both sides of the olive wood, I want to rebuild the mould, reinstall the table inverted, so I can then fill the cracks on the underside. Just give it a quick once over on the sled to expose the raw wood on both sides, making sure to level it out just to remove any unevenness that may have occurred during the curing process, particularly where the blocks to hold down the wood were placed. Sometimes they can develop a small meniscus around them, which will make it slightly uneven when you put it back in the mould. Just a quick once over with the sled, and then we can pop it back into the mould. So after making sure there's no dust on the table, I've rebuilt the mould, obviously sealed it with the silicone, allowed it to dry, and then I can pop the 2 pieces back in. My daughter's convinced me to use something other than a black resin. I seem to use a lot of black resin. I think it's very nice with olive wood, but here I'm using a blue metallic, which should fill in the gaps and the cracks nicely. So there's just a 24-hour curing process on this shallow pour resin. There's no need to use a deep pour. Went over it with a torch, a blow torch, after about 3 or 4 hours, just removed any bubbles. There weren't that many. And then the following day came back and it popped out the mould very easily. So once again, it's back down to the router sled. It's unbelievable the amount of mess it makes. I really do need to get some kind of extraction. Luckily I can do it outside, and I've got a very understanding wife who cleans up meticulously. The resin for these two pieces came out reasonably well. There weren't too many bubbles that needed repairing. There were some areas on the wood, quite a few areas on the wood that needed attention, but we'll come on to that in a moment. We did have one on the serving tray, but this hole was too small to allow the glue to flow into. The small air bubbles get trapped inside. So I went over it with a Dremel, enlarged the hole, and then when applying the glue, which has quite a high viscosity, it allows the glue to fall into the hole. Quick splurt with the activator, leave it for 30 seconds or a minute, and then you can sand over it, and it comes out pretty invisible. When it comes to the finishing process for these pieces, which is pretty much from sanding onwards, for me this is the most difficult part. Regardless of how easy other people in videos make it look, you really do need to be methodical in your process, going through every grit of sandpaper very slowly. To give you an indication, the sanding process for both sides of this table probably took between 2.5 and 3 hours. I'd normally start with a 120 grit paper, but the router left some marks. I think I probably need to sharpen the router a bit. So I went down to an 80 grit, which was quite a coarse paper, and then from that onto 120, 180, 240, 320, and then I ended up with a 400 grit. So I mentioned before that there were some areas of the wood that needed repairing. Unfortunately, the resin hadn't seeped into the cracks adequately. So for this I'm going to be using a furniture restoration wax and a heat gun. So you just soften the wax with a heat gun, making sure you don't burn yourself like a muppet. The wax then runs quite freely into the cracks, solidifies quite quickly, and is workable in a couple of minutes. So I'm just using a flexible spatula to encourage the wax into the holes. Then afterwards you can just heat the spatula slightly, which removes any excess from the top of the wood, which can then be reused. This process is done after I finish with a 120 grit, before I continue any further. So I fiddle the holes, make sure everything's nice and clean, and then continue with the higher grits. Even though the majority of the wax can be removed with a heated spatula after the application, when it comes to sanding, the sanding pads get clogged up very easily. As I mentioned before, I'm using the 120 pads here, and I'd probably use between 6 and 7 pads on each side. So the last thing to do before we move on to the higher grits and the polishing of the table is just to do the edges. One of the other tools that I don't have is a palm router. I only have the router that I use in my router sled, which, although being very powerful, is a bit tricky to use on the edges. It has a tendency to tip over. So what I've done is just attach it to a board, and from the time that you have your hand firmly on the board at all times, there's no danger of the router tilting and then the router bit digging into the side of the wood. So I sanded up to a 400 grit. I'm going to be finishing the wood with an Osmo, but before I do so I just want to give this cutting compound a go. I've used it before on serving trays and it's come out very nicely. Apply it quite sparsely, should really be wearing gloves, and then just polish it with a sponge polishing pad. I'll put a link in the description below of the one that I'm using. Don't worry too much about going over the wood with a sponge pad when you are polishing. It doesn't really have any adverse effect. The beauty of this also is that as soon as you finish polishing, you're then ready to use your finished wood product. So the wood product I'm using here is Osmo. I'm a big fan of Osmo, not least because it has various products for various types of wood. The 1101 which I'm using is for a very hard wood, olive being one of them. Anything less than a walnut, for example, you'll use a 3043. Anything harder than a walnut, then it's the 1101. So you apply it quite liberally and then leave it for half an hour. One of the things I see a lot of in other videos is them applying product and then polishing straight away. The wood needs time to absorb the product, and over the period of that half an hour or so you'll see certain areas where the wood has absorbed more product than the others, and you need to feed more product into those certain areas. So once you can see a uniform finish over the wood, all the product has been absorbed evenly, then we can start the buffing process. Shouldn't take too long. The main purpose of it really is only to remove the excess from the wood and the resin. If you find yourself buffing for too long, it means that you've applied too much product. I mean, it happens, I've done it a few times, but before I start the buffing process, just go over it, just wipe over the surface with a couple of pieces of kitchen roll. This will remove any unnecessary excess from the surface, and then when you start the buffing, it shouldn't take more than 2 or 3 minutes on each side. When you do the first coat, obviously you're going to want to do both sides so it dries evenly. You don't want one side drying and the other side having been untreated. So when you do flip it over, you're going to get some marks. But when you come back to give it the second coat, you can just do one side at a time. So you do the first side, leave it to dry, flip it over, and then you can do the second side. So there you have it. It's a nice even finish over the wood and the resin. It's always nice to see the reflective qualities of the resin when you go over it. The blue metallic came out quite nicely. Unfortunately in this video it's not particularly apparent, but when the light does catch it, it does create a bit of a feature. And the main thing being that the client was happy with it. Unfortunately she hadn't decided on the legs yet. She wanted to see the finished table before she chose a design for the legs, so I won't be able to show you that. But before I go, I just wanted to show you the process of cleaning the HDPE mould so you can reuse it. Any resin that's been spilt onto the mould can simply be removed with a blunt instrument, but for the cleaning process itself I'm just using a 400 grit paper. What you'll find after a while, after a couple of uses, is that a very thin film of resin starts to appear on the surface, but this can simply be sanded away with a 400 grit. Then change to a Scotch pad, which then removes any excess dust and leaves it with a brand new finish. So if you're interested in any of our moulds, just visit our website rivertables.es. There's moulds of various sizes there which we ship all over the world. If there's a size there that you can't see, just drop us a line and I'm sure we'll be able to accommodate. So the discount code I've just put down in the bottom part of the video, just apply that on the checkout page and then you'll be able to receive that discount. As always, I'm keen to hear any comments or suggestions that you have about this video, or if you have any questions, just leave a message in the comments below. I'm relatively good at getting back to people within a day or so. Thanks for watching guys, I hope you found it informative.